Hey there. We're going to spend some time today talking about the political economy of the United Kingdom, and in service of that goal, the first thing we're going to do is a little bit of history. Two big things about the big picture economic history of the United Kingdom that you need to know in order for this all to make sense. The first, and hopefully you're already vaguely familiar with this from me or some other excellent world history teacher, is that England is the home, starting in the mid 1700s, of the Industrial Revolution. That is to say, this advance in manufacturing technologies that's going to massively increase human productivity by using non-biological sources of energy. So burning coal instead of having humans or animals or streams or the wind power your machinery. A couple of effects of the Industrial Revolution writ large. Number one, you're going to see a massive and rapid increase in manufacturing productivity. So in layman's terms, England is just suddenly going to start making a whole lot more stuff. Woven textiles, so manufacturing cloth, is going to be kind of the first major product, but a bunch of other stuff is going to start pouring out of British factories as well. Number two, partly because of the draw of these industrial jobs in factories, and partly because of some changes in agricultural policy, you're going to see rapid urbanization in England as well. People are suddenly going to move in gigantic numbers from the countryside into the cities. Going along with that is the creation of a new socioeconomic class known as the urban working class, or in Marxist terms, the proletariat, who are these people who are suddenly living in cities, working in factories, often in really grim conditions, very little control, very little protections for their safety, very little provision for their children's education, etc. And starting around the 1830s, you will start to see reformers pay attention to that and the government start to legislate for that. One other implication of the Industrial Revolution is that it's going to go hand in hand with the growth of the British Empire. Industrialization is going to spur the English, and by the way, other industrializing countries as well, to search for more raw materials abroad that they can't necessarily get at home. As my high school economics teacher was very fond of saying, England is just an island with fish and tea, which is not necessarily the ingredients for the Industrial Revolution. You're also going to see the English try to colonize other countries in search of new markets for their exported materials, because they're producing more stuff than they could reasonably expect their domestic consuming population to buy. And so the Industrial Revolution is going to go hand in hand with the expansion of the British Empire. The other big theme of this sort of big picture history is that Britain for a long time is implementing what are known as small L liberal economic policies. We've said a number of times in this course that the word liberal, frustratingly, has about 17 different meanings in different contexts. So I mean this in terms of a liberal political economy, which is to say the less government, the better. Scotland specifically is the home of Adam Smith, whose book The Wealth of Nations in 1776 laid out this theory that basically if you leave people to engage in free market exchanges on their own terms, seeking their own benefit, that's ultimately going to lead to better results for everybody else compared to having the state try and intervene to manage the economy. And for a long time, England's economy is run largely along those lines. There's always some exceptions whenever anybody says, oh, the government just stayed out of the way and let the people do their thing. But in general, the British government is going to pursue policies of low taxes, low tariffs, low regulation. Starting around the 1830s, you will start to see the state make some more active interventions, particularly in order to do things like restrict working hours, restrict child labor, make some kind of minimal protections for sanitation in these increasingly densely populated industrial cities in England, and to kind of minimize maybe a couple of protections for workers' safety in the factories, etc. But by and large, the government is going to maintain this idea that it should largely stay out of the economy and let the market do its thing. Let's fast forward to the post-World War II period, which is where we're going to see gigantic shifts, as you already know, in Britain's both economic and political history. Your textbook has, frankly, this kind of snarky phrase along the lines of Britain's economic history. The picture of Britain's economy since World War II is largely one of decline, which I personally think is a little bit overstated, but I think it probably is fair to say that in relative terms, the United Kingdom is no longer the dominant economic power that it was, 150, 200 years ago. The United Kingdom is still it's unquestionably still a rich country, but it's no longer as economically dominant. And you can see newer economic powers like the United States, Japan, South Korea, start to compete with the United Kingdom. Ireland and Australia, for instance, have now higher GDPs per capita than the United Kingdom do, which is particularly, I think, ironic or surprising because those were both formerly ruled by and to some extent economically exploited by the government of the United Kingdom. The second thing to note in this post-World War II period is that, as with other rich countries, there has been a shift from manufacturing to services. So Britain may be the home of the Industrial Revolution, but is certainly no longer leading the world in manufacturing output. Today, 80% of the UK's GDP is accounted for by services, and only 19% is accounted for by industry. Number three, in the post-World War II period, you saw the relatively rapid dismantling of the British Empire. A lot of its colonies are going to gain independence between the end of the war in 1945 and about 1970. And you will start to see, to some degree, the British kind of belatedly turning towards Europe and saying, oh, wait, maybe we actually should be a part of the continent and its economy, because they can no longer rely, to the degree they once did, on their colonies to be guaranteed markets for their exports and sources of their raw imports. Finally, and something that we mentioned when we talked about British history, is this emergence of what's known as the collectivist consensus. As a reminder for you, that's this kind of agreement between both major political parties across broad spectrums of political attitude, that the state needs to basically turn inward, stop focusing so much on empire, rebuild after the Second World War, and increase its spending on the social safety net. The implication of that is that the state is going to pay less attention to economic modernization, and also that it's going to take a much more active role in the economy, which, depending on your ideology, might mean that the state is finally looking out for its citizens, that was always supposed to do, or might mean that the state is unnecessarily interfering in the economy and dragging down efficiency and productivity and growth and people's individual freedom and well-being. Depends how you see it. Fast forward to the 1970s, and you'll start to see, with the advent of Margaret Thatcher's administration in 1979, you'll start to see that collectivist consensus break down, and the United Kingdom is going to shift to a different ideology known as neoliberalism. This definition, in quotes, is taken directly from the College Board Bible, which is called the Course and Exam Description. They're going to define for you neoliberalism as a belief in limited government intervention in the economy and society. In other words, we're going to see this kind of ideology in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in many other countries, both in and beyond this course, emerging starting in the 70s and 80s, that the state has been doing too much and it needs to start backing away and letting the free market do its thing, as Adam Smith had called for 200 plus years ago. Under the Thatcher administration and her successors, worth noting that Thatcher kind of starts this shift, but she is by no means the only person pushing it, you're going to see increasing privatization. So under Thatcher, the government is going to sell off a bunch of different state-owned industries. British Airways, the manufacturers of Jaguar and Rolls-Royce vehicles, British Steel, a steel manufacturing company, a lot of the gas, the water, the telephone utilities, council housing, which is government-owned public housing in the United Kingdom. And then under her successors, you're going to see further privatization. Again, this is not just a Thatcher thing. So the railroads will be increasingly privatized. Air traffic control will be increasingly privatized. The mail service, the Royal Mail, will be privatized. And so you're going to see just a significant decrease in the state's share of ownership in these various economic interests. You're also going to see, particularly after Thatcher, a shift away from the kind of social safety net for low-income and unemployed people, away from kind of guaranteed social welfare programs, towards two ways of limiting people's eligibility for social welfare programs. One is what's known as means testing, so saying that you must meet some test, you must pass some threshold for need or for poverty or for disability in order to be able to access that state support. The other is what's known as welfare to work policies. We saw a similar shift under Bill Clinton's administration in the United States, which is in which people who are receiving economic support from the state are encouraged or forced or pushed to seek work, and often required to demonstrate that they're looking for paid employment in order to continue receiving benefits. So you start seeing the state pull back some of those welfare programs as well. It's worth noting that this, I said a couple times that this isn't just a Thatcher thing. It's also not just a conservative thing. The Labour Party, which for a long time, post-World War II, had been advocating for this very aggressive state role in the economy, including ownership of key industries like steel and banking, Labour is going to dial that back a little bit. So if you fast forward to their 2019 election manifesto, you'll see them supporting some renationalization of what are more traditionally public services, like the mail and the railways. But you're no longer going to see people like Sir Keir Starmer go out there calling for the reestablishment of a state-owned steel manufacturer, a state-owned airline. So there has been some shift in political culture overall, not just in the policies of a single party or a single prime minister. It's difficult, and there's, of course, a massive scholarly debate about whether this has been good or bad or what the effects have been, but I think it's fair to characterize just a couple of broad effects of this period of neoliberal reforms. Number one, economic growth did accelerate after the 1970s, 1980s in the United Kingdom. Again, the United Kingdom is no longer a world-beating economic power. It's no longer like the number one economy in the universe, but it is growing. It did grow considerably faster after many of these reforms were implemented. On the flip side, you also see increasing inequality, which I think is probably what you would expect anytime the state explicitly says, we're going to dial back our role in economic redistribution. Okay, fast forward one more time to 2008, and we're going to introduce what has become one of the more controversial and ugly words in British politics, even though it has pretty straightforward meaning, and that is austerity. Two problems confronting the United Kingdom's budget as of 2008. There's a long-term one and an immediate trigger. The long-term issue is Britain's demographic situation, and I'm going to show you population pyramids. That's that image that form of data that visually depicts the distribution of population across gender and age brackets in a country. I'm going to show you the population pyramid for every 10 years between 1950 and 2020. Yeah. So just take a look at the pattern that you're emerging. Here's 1950, and then we're going to advance through to 2020. And if you observe this pattern, what you'll see is the population pyramid kind of becoming a little bit more top-heavy, a little bit narrower at the bottom. In other words, the population of the United Kingdom, as is again going to be the case with most other rich countries in this period, is going to be aging. You're going to start seeing a higher share of the population be older or retired people. You're going to start seeing a smaller share of the population be younger working age people. And I think it's just worth noting this decline or this aging would be a little bit more pronounced in the absence of immigration into the United Kingdom. So what that means for the budget is that the United Kingdom has this aging population. Older folks are going to draw more on state pensions as they retire. They need economic support. And they're going to draw more on the National Health Service. They're going to have greater, more expensive healthcare needs. The NHS, as I've said before in this class, is one of the single most popular things that the British government has ever done in its entire history. And so there continues to be really strong public demand for expansion of public services, and particularly for greater funding for healthcare, for lower consumer costs for healthcare. So politically, it's really, really untenable for any British politician to come out and say, actually, I think you should probably have to pay more for a mammogram. On the other hand, those expenses are getting greater because of this demographic shift. And at the same time, there's a smaller relative base of working age people who are paying taxes into the system in order to keep it financially solvent. So expenses are increasing. The tax base is not increasing in order to keep pace. And this has been putting the British budget under a fundamental set of pressures that long predate the more immediate trigger for austerity. That said, things are really going to hit the fan in 2008 when a financial crisis that starts in the United States will ripple worldwide. And that's really going to put a dent in British tax revenues and increase British state spending for stuff like support for unemployed people. And so by 2008, and particularly by the time of the 2010 general election, it's very, very clear to British politicians on basically all parts of the political spectrum that in order to avoid some sort of massive budget crisis, you're going to have to make some significant changes. We see two different responses after the 2008 crisis. Number one, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair's successor, a Labour Party prime minister, probably the prime minister I mentioned the least in this course, is going to he's going to promote policies of regulation and of fiscal stimulus. So he's going to say, as John Maynard Keynes would have said, we should borrow some money, we should pump it into the economy. The state should be responsible for stimulating economic demand while people are unwilling or unable to do it. So under Brown, you see this kind of state-centric approach to addressing the financial crisis doesn't necessarily involve making massive cuts in state spending. On the other hand, after the 2010 election, we then shift over to a coalition government led by Prime Minister David Cameron of the Conservative Party and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democratic Party, and they call for austerity, which means just cuts in public spending in order to balance the budget. They essentially say to the British public, it is time to tighten our belts, times are tough, and the state can't afford to be giving out quite as many free services as it previously did. A couple of results of austerity, which was implemented starting with with the coalition government and has continued in some limited form, although subsequent governments have tried to scale it back up to the present day. Number one, there's a definite decline in the deficit. Let me show you this in pictorial form. You can see here this kind of trough right before 2010. That's when the effects of the financial crisis really hit, and Britain's budget deficit gets bigger than it has been in decades. But then, on the other hand, you're going to start to see the deficit shrink. That's that blue line getting closer to the 0% line. You're going to start to see the deficit shrink after those austerity policies are implemented under that coalition government. So, in the strict sense of we need to balance the books, austerity works. It does what it said it was going to do on the tin. On the other hand, as you might imagine, cutting public services in the middle of an economic recession is not a super politically popular thing to do. And so you're going to see these massive public protests calling for an end to austerity. This isn't unique to the United Kingdom. You'll see it, among other things, basically across Europe. But in the United Kingdom, since that's what we care about today, this is going to be pretty politically significant. And you might actually be surprised that in 2015, the Conservatives not only hold on to government, but increase their majority, given the difficulty that austerity policies have prevented for people. The Conservatives don't necessarily feel immediate electoral negative effects. The party that actually really loses out as a result of austerity, at least in the short term, is the Liberal Democrats, because you'll recall that they had agreed to join in coalition with the Conservative Party. And many of their supporters, once the Lib Dems embrace austerity policies, are going to say they have sold us out, they have compromised too much in order to be in coalition. So here's an image from protests. I think these are in London. You see a bunch of socialist worker paraphernalia here because socialists, broadly speaking, are really good at making protest signs. But it's worth noting that the people who are angry at austerity are not necessarily political radicals. There's a pretty broad spectrum of people who are upset about these policies. One thing that particularly gets people upset, and one thing that helps explain why the Lib Dems seem to suffer the most as a result of embracing this program, is that Nick Clegg, the leader of the Lib Dem party, had promised in that 2010 campaign that one of the things he was absolutely not going to do in implementing austerity was raise the fees that British students paid to go to university. The British government subsidizes pretty considerably the tuition for students who go to school in England and Wales. Scotland, you might remember, subsidizes fees entirely for Scottish students going to Scottish universities. And so Nick Clegg says, I absolutely make an ironclad promise that I am not going to do this. And then they go ahead and do it. They raise the student contribution to tuition from something like £6,000, £9,000 a year, or maybe it's a little higher. For an American, that's inconsequentially cheap because we're used to paying bananas amounts of money for college. But in the United Kingdom, this particular promise is the fact that Clegg breaks it in the coalition is particularly unpopular and might help explain why the Lib Dems are going to have a massive collapse in the 2015 election. In 2010, going into the 2015 election, they held 57 seats in Parliament. Coming out of the 2015 election, the Lib Dems have only 8 seats in Parliament. So join coalitions at your own risk. Last thing to note is the role of Europe in the British economy. And of course, you've heard a lot about this because of Brexit. But it's also worth noting that for reasons of geography, proximity, cultural ties, technology, transit links, et cetera, the European Union is by far the United Kingdom's largest trade partner. The US is the largest single country with which the United Kingdom trades, but if you take the European Union member states collectively, the UK has far more economic involvement with the EU than it does with the United States. So just a little bit of a backstory, in case you were not familiar with this. The European Union is a supranational organization as opposed to an intergovernmental organization. That means that the EU has some power to take sovereignty in specified areas away from its member states. The EU can make some policies that its member states have to enforce if they want to remain in that supranational organization. The particular purpose of the EU is to promote trade liberalization and economic integration. So its basic job is to encourage its members to trade more freely with each other, and it is often doing things that are designed to make trade flow more freely with lower tariffs and fewer regulations and fewer delays between its member states. The UK came a little bit late to the European Union. Part of that has to do with the legacy of empire. Part of that has to do with proximity to or a close relationship with the United States. The UK seeing itself as an Atlantic power rather than a European power. And conversely, a number of European countries, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, were particularly reluctant to admit the United Kingdom to the EU's predecessor organizations. But long story short, in 1973, the UK joins the European communities, which will subsequently become the European Union. So they get there eventually. And this continues to help orient the UK's economy towards further trade and integration with Europe. In 1992, those European communities member states agree that they want to take further steps towards union, toward turning into a supranational organization, as opposed to just kind of a club of like minded, geographically proximate nations. And so they negotiate a document called the Maastricht Treaty, which is what creates the modern European Union. At that time, the United Kingdom negotiates a number of exceptions, suggesting that the UK's relationship with Europe has always been a little bit ambivalent, has always been a little bit one foot in the water, one foot still out of the water. So one of the most important exceptions that UK negotiates is that the Maastricht Treaty obliged all EU member states to sign up eventually to a common currency called the euro, which will ultimately be introduced in 2002. And the UK puts a little asterisk on their signature on that part of the treaty saying, we're actually going to wait on that decision. You can't make us do it. The idea behind the euro is that it's going to do exactly what the EU always says it's supposed to do, which is to facilitate international trade and investment, to make it easier for people in one European country to do business with people in another European country, because they don't have to worry about converting currency, they don't have to worry about exchange rates. The trade-off for member states is that they're going to sacrifice some of their sovereignty. They're going to give up control over monetary policy, over things like interest rates, over things like how much money to print. They're going to give that control up to the European Union. And for reasons that you can probably intuit, the United Kingdom ultimately says, we're not interested in joining this. And so the United Kingdom opts to retain the pound as its currency. I find this a little bit charming and a little bit odd, but the pound has actually become a symbol of the UK Independence Party, which was one of the major organizations pushing for Brexit. Here you see its leader, Nigel Farage, holding an umbrella with the UKIP logo on it with a pound sign behind it. I will give you 5 bonus points. In my heart, they are worth nothing in my gradebook. If you can find for me any other political party in the world whose symbol is its country's currency. So we're thinking about Europe as a source of both economic growth for the United Kingdom, but also as a source of political controversy. And of course, when we talk about Brexit and the UK's foreign policy, we'll say much, much more about that. That's all for today. Thanks.